takes a village to do this, you know. Someone's got to get this up, give me a remote, give me a microphone. It's lovely to be here, and I'm glad to see that Stella really does exist. I've been hearing about her for a long time. All right. Haven't spoken for a while at IMPaX because my schedule and IMPaX schedules didn't match. They match today. So I get to talk to you about some really brand new stuff that is pretty much only out in research papers. We're going to talk about three things. Now, Justin, how does this work? Do I press the right side of the circle? It works. But before we start, I want to do brain benders. How many of you have done brain benders before? Good, because it boots up your brain. These are whole brain puzzles. They're believed to be anti-aging. There are hundreds of them on my website that you can go and practice on day by day. Each little box is a puzzle. Your left hemisphere, for almost everyone regardless of handedness, reads the letters and the words. Your right hemisphere looks at where they are in relation to each other and in the box. And that just lets you come up with some kind of little phrase. I like to say there's no right or wrong answers. There's only the ones that I thought of. And some people might think of some more. So let's look at top left. What's the word? Out. And the phrase would be spread out. What else?
Spaced out.
Spaced out. Good. What else? How about out of touch? You know, we could spend a long time coming up with other examples. Second on the left. Chinese checkers. That's the only one I thought of till I was lecturing in the Orient. And somebody said, why can't that be check on the Chinese? Third on the left. A word in a word. Throw in the towel. Brain doesn't care whether letters go forwards or backwards. Sometimes I write things backwards just to give the brain more practice. You could read an entire book with all the words written backwards and your brain could do it. Fourth on the left. Sign on the dotted line, or nobody has signed on the dotted line. It's there, but there's no signature. Top right, timing is what?
Good.
Good. Second on the right, look where?
Look at the bright side.
Third on the right. Light at the end of the tunnel, good. Bottom right.
Sit down.
Could be sit down. Get a little more sophisticated.
Sit up.
Could be sit up because it is up. What's underneath the word? Lines. Where are the lines in relation to the rest of the box? Sit on the sidelines. There you go. Now, for those of you who've never done those before, your brain has already laid out a piece of software so that if you want to do it again, you've got a leg up. And that's the good news and the bad news. The good news is if it's something that's good for you and you want to do it, it's easier to do it again. The bad news is if it's not good for you, it's also easier to do it again, which is often what leads people down the path to addictive behaviors. All right, last one. Give me 2 words for this puzzle.
Before and after.
I told you there's no right or wrong. How many of you are musicians? Okay, so what you're looking at on the top is the way you write out music in the treble clef. And you've got a treble clef sign, and you've got some notes, and what else have you got? Lines. In the second one, what's missing? The lines are gone. So translate that into real life. If you get rid of the lines, what have you likely had? A facelift. I think that's really cute. This one I didn't make. I got that one from, I was over listening to a play in Stockton. It's very, very clever. Well, but you want to stretch your brain. That's also anti-aging. All right, 3 updates. Brand new information about the brain and immune system, new information about the brain and suicide, and more information about brain shrinkage and memory. So let's go. First, I've been lecturing for IMPaX before the company was launched. And I have been taking EnerPrime ever since. And this would be a good time for you to tell me how wonderful I look. Because that's been about 50 years ago. And some of you, the very first seminar I ever put on for IMPaX was on the immune system. And back then I said, from everything that we know now and from everything I've learned, whatever you do for your brain is also good for your immune system. And whatever you do for your immune system is also good for your brain. And somebody said to me, well, where's the proof of that? And I said, there are no studies that I know of that shows there's a direct connection. But anecdotally, you can take 2 groups of people. One group is focusing on building up their immune system and their brain function improves. And the other group is focused on building up brain function and their immune system improves. Over and over and over again. So there has to be something. Well, this is one of my favorite metaphors. The brain and the immune system have their hands shoved so deeply in each other's pockets that it's hard to tell who is who and which is which. And we did know that there are some immune system cells in the bloodstream, white blood cells, other kinds of immune system messengers. So the prevailing wisdom was the only connection between the brain and the immune system comes through the immune system cells that get to the brain through the bloodstream. And everybody accepted that as for real. University of Virginia School of Medicine, brand new research. They have made, quotes, a stunning discovery that overturns decades of textbook teaching. This is 2016. We're just learning this. The brain is directly connected to the immune system by lymph vessels that previously nobody thought existed. Jonathan Kipnis, he's the director of the Center for Brain Immunology and Glia, the supporting cells of the neurons. And this is what he said: this changes entirely the way we perceive the neuroimmune interaction. We believe that for every neurological disease that has an immune component, these vessels may play a major role. There is an array of other neurological diseases, from autism to multiple sclerosis, that are now being reconsidered in light of this information. And he went on to say, in Alzheimer's, there are accumulations of big protein chunks in the brain that may be accumulating because they're not being efficiently removed by these vessels. So do you understand what he's saying? The brain problems are because of problems with the immune system. And who knew? All right, here's a drawing to show you where these are, because I think it's just staggeringly exciting. You know, I'm sure, that the lymph vessels are different from blood vessels. The lymph vessels need the muscle movement around them to move the lymph fluid through them. There's probably 250,000 miles of lymph vessels in the average person's body. And I just don't even know how to estimate what that's like. We know that a really large person probably has 100,000 miles of blood vessels. Somebody my size probably has 60,000. But 250,000 miles is just staggering. These lymph vessels, we knew, went throughout the body, went through the lymph nodes, but now we find that they are in those 3 meningeal layers that cover the brain. And it's just amazing to me, all the dissection that's been done, that they've never found them till now. So you can see the skull is on top, and down at the bottom is the actual brain tissue. And there are 3 layers that cover the brain and protect it. The top one is the dura mater, the middle one is the arachnoid, and the third one is the pia mater, if you're interested in their names. And they're filled with lymph vessels that are bringing immune properties directly into the brain and going back to the immune system and telling the immune system what's going on in the brain. I just think it would be fun to listen in on some of those conversations, you know. Things aren't going too well up here today. You know, such and such has happened, and you know, I knew when I got out of bed this morning that a bad day was coming on. And you already know that the brain will only do what it thinks it can do. And it knows what it can do only when you tell it what it can do. And that's the whole purpose of speaking and thinking affirmingly. So supplements. I've always said, well, I started out saying I take EnerPrime for my immune system and Delta E for my brain. But I'm changing that. I take EnerPrime and Delta E for my brain. I take Delta E and EnerPrime for my immune system. And we know that there is now an absolute direct connection. They are physically connected. They still have their hands in each other's pockets. All right, suicide. I hadn't spent a lot of time digging out the research on suicide until fairly recently, and there have been a lot of apparent suicides around the world lately. In fact, the current information is that the #1 cause of death in the country of China in people aged 70 or over is because of suicides. Recently, I was asked to go up to Paradise, the city, not the celestial. I was asked to go up to Paradise and do a memorial service for a young woman who had been killed by a drunk driver. And within the next 5 weeks, 2 of her classmates killed themselves, apparently distraught over her death. And so it was a pretty, you know, horrific occurrence for a relatively small town like Paradise. So they asked me to come and do the memorial service and to speak on suicide and grief recovery. And I'm going, oh my goodness. Okay, well, that's quite an assignment. So I started digging into what we're now learning about the brain and suicide. And if you don't already know this, I think you'll find it really interesting. Cornelius van Heeringen, MD, in the Netherlands, has been doing lots of research about suicide, and he came up with this overall description, if you will. He said that his research leads him to believe that suicide is a unique entity that is impacted by several aspects: depression, impulsivity, disinhibition, anxiety, and executive function dysregulation. Now, executive function, there's a drawing of a cutaway of the brain. Executive function is over on that left point, right here behind your forehead. And that's where you have conscience, willpower, critical thinking, morality, those sophisticated, if you want to call them that, although after the tragedy in Florida, I'm not sure how sophisticated some brains are. But it houses the kind of complexity that's not found in the brains of mammals. You know, we have supposedly a little bit of advantage there. One of the reasons I started looking at this is a woman contacted me, distraught beyond measure, because a close friend of hers had killed herself. And they went to plan the funeral at the religious organization to which they belonged. And they were told that the parishioner could not be buried in the church cemetery because she had killed herself, and that was a violation of the sixth commandment. And she was just beside herself. I went back to work by Candace B. Pert, one of the National Institutes of Health researchers, who was the first person to identify opiate receptors in the brain, and that's changed how we deal with addictive behaviors. And she was very clear that any brain that's involved in a grip of a strong emotion is what she called in an altered state. And that's especially true when you're talking about the three protective emotions that are orchestrated out of the right hemisphere: anger, fear, and sadness. And that suicide likely occurs only in a brain that is in an altered state. That's the first thing I want you to get. Because if the brain is in an absolutely altered state, then there's questions about whether or not that brain was capable of the kind of cognitive thinking that would make them make rational decisions. So I collected several ways that research is now showing the brain can be in an altered state that can lead to suicide. So the first one is the release of corticotropin releasing factor. How many of you are familiar with that? Have you heard that term? Well, it's CRF for short, and I don't care if you remember the names, I just want you to know that I know them. So in response to whatever that brain perceives as a stressor, and it's different for every brain, when that brain perceives a stressor, the hypothalamus in the middle layer, I've had a friend of mine do a drawing of the cutaway of the brain and pull it apart so you can see the layers. So the mammalian layer is that middle layer, subconscious layer, called mammalian because all mammals have it. And of course, as human beings, we're mammals. So when the brain perceives a stressor, it literally reacts in nanosecond speeds and pours out corticotropin releasing factor in just seconds. That powerful substance, and it's powerful because it's both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. When I say that, do you know what that means? Up and down means yes. Okay? 15 seconds. You know what a neurotransmitter is. It's a powerful substance that transmits information from one neuron to another neuron across the synapse. That's how you think. That's all thinking is, moving information from one neuron to another neuron. So when something triggers a neurotransmitter, it's going to impact every single neuron in your brain and your heart and your gut, and probably other places that we haven't discovered them yet. When it's a hormone, you know that a hormone, you have a minuscule fraction of a drop of a hormone. Give me some hormones. Estrogen. DHEA, testosterone. Insulin, there's lots of them. When you have something that's a hormone, just this little teeny piece of that will impact every single cell in your body. So when you have a substance that's both, it's a slam dunk. You're totally involved. All your neurons and every other cell. So CRF gets released and it goes down to the reptilian layer, that first brain layer, into the brain stem. There is an alarm center there, powerful alarm center. And it activates that alarm center. Now, the alarm center spreads the information throughout the body, which then goes back and impacts the neocortex, this thinking part of your brain, and that all happens in a matter of minutes. Okay, got that? It's amazing. I wish our fire departments acted that quickly. A couple of things about CRF, because we're learning how immensely powerful it is. First of all, it can suppress appetite. So researchers are looking at anorexia in terms of the possibility of a corticotropin releasing factor impact, because it suppresses appetite. It can increase a person's subjective anxiety, meaning how bad you think something is. It's linked with euphoric feelings that accompany alcoholism, which is one of the reasons it's so difficult to deal with alcoholism, because when you first put alcohol in the brain, it releases corticotropin releasing factor because alcohol is a stressor for the brain. And so immediately that CRF gives you a little feeling of euphoria. Here's the problem. If somebody knew how to get that little feeling of euphoria and stop drinking, it'd be really pretty good. But we've never found a brain on the planet that knows where that line is. It triggers the inflammatory process in the brain and the body. That's now being investigated in terms of multiple sclerosis research. And finally, high levels of CRF have been found in the cerebral spinal fluid of individuals who committed suicide. So the body and the brain is totally involved with this atom bomb substance, if you will, when people kill themselves. An increase in levels of cortisol. I'm sure you're familiar with the word cortisol. It's got lots of important functions. Elevated 24-hour urinary cortisol production was found in patients who recently attempted suicide compared with patients who are depressed but who did not have a history of suicidal behavior. So not only is the brain and body involved with CRF, now they've got high levels of cortisol. 3, the serotonin system. Serotonin does lots of things in the brain and body. It impacts your mood. It impacts how well you sleep. Neurons in the reptilian layer, that first layer, they're the neurons that produce serotonin. And then they have long axons that reach out to other parts of the brain. And that serotonin is carried to everywhere in the brain. It's also carried to the gut. 90% of all the serotonin in your brain and body is not even in your brain. It's in your gastrointestinal system. So it's no wonder you get upset and you get GI symptoms. You know, you get cramps, or you get flatus, or you get diarrhea, or you're constipated. Because the gut's probably got as many neurons in it as your brain does. It's even being called the second brain by some individuals. So abnormal levels of serotonin, doesn't matter whether it's too high or too low, abnormal levels are going to give you a problem. In suicide, neurons appear to send less than normal amounts of serotonin to the prefrontal cortex, and this is where you make decisions. So there's a dysregulation in the serotonin system in people who commit suicide. 4, low levels of cholesterol. How often have you been hearing about low levels of cholesterol? For most people, it's too high. What can I do to bring it down? Well, here's the deal. Cholesterol is really important in the brain and body. Way more important than most people understand. Does all kinds of things. It's the precursor for the synthesis of cortisol. And that's an important stress substance. Progesterone, testosterone, estrogen, vitamin D. That's one of the reasons sometimes people really need to do hormone balancing. It impacts memory. problem is that lowered levels of cholesterol, and it doesn't matter how they got lowered. They could get lowered because you've gone on a really strict diet. It could be lowered because you're taking statins or other types of medications. Lowered levels of cholesterol have been linked with increased suicide risk. So are you beginning to get a picture of how this brain can be altered and therefore do something that it would never ever do if it was not in an altered state? And the last one, excessive activity of the norepinephrine system. Here's another one of those hormone and neurotransmitter substances. Huge. It mobilizes the body for action. So now you've got a brain that's not thinking really very clearly, not making good decisions, but outpours the norepinephrine that makes them want to do something. And so maybe they hear about somebody else who killed themselves or somebody else who died or who knows what, and they take action, but unfortunately it's not action based on good cognitive strength. Elevated levels of norepinephrine inhibit activity in the prefrontal cortex. That's where you're making the decisions, you're planning, you're executing. And unfortunately, that's linked with increased risks for suicide. So what would be important about knowing about this? For yourself, number one, but certainly as you talk to other people and hear their stories, and sometimes the family feels worse after a suicidal death about all the ramifications, and everybody's saying, ooh, what was wrong with them? You know, their history, you're never going to see them again. No, would never want to bury them in consecrated ground. Hello, they broke the sixth commandment. Hopefully you'll be able to make a few comments about suicide doesn't happen unless the brain is in an altered state. And there's lots of things that can alter that state. Sadness is the appropriate emotion that arises in response to a loss. So it doesn't matter whether it was suicide, just a loss. And there's all kinds of losses. Thinking back to my college years, certainly glad I'm done with those. Brain wasn't done back then, I'll tell you that. You know, you desperately want a certain person to ask you out, you know, to the weekend event. And back then, women never asked men out. Well, he asked somebody else. And that's a loss for some women. And grieving that is appropriate. You know, hopefully you don't do it for very long, but you need to grieve losses, recover, and move on. The problem is if you hang on to grief for any reason for long periods of time, it can alter immune system function. And I've got 2 slides about this because I think I just got this information down at Stanford about a month ago. You've all heard, I'm sure, of cytokines. They're an immune system property, and they are designed to regulate the immune system going on and off. There is something called pro-inflammatory cytokines, and they coordinate the inflammation process in the body. You know, you get a cut, those pro-inflammatory cytokines will go to the location of the cut and create heat and redness and swelling as the immune system is healing that. There are 2 main types. Some come from white blood cells, the lymphokines, and some comes from the monocytes, and they're called monokines. And I don't know whether you want to know that or not, but for those of you who do, there's 2 main types. So here's the deal. Increased levels of the pro-inflammatory cytokines that increase inflammation have been linked with depressive symptoms. Dysphoria, fastest way to remember that is it's the opposite of euphoria. Anhedonia, nothing feels good, aren't interested in anything. Fatigue, apathy, a sense of helplessness. People with depression have increased levels of pre-inflammatory cytokines, which probably helps explain the reason that autoimmune diseases and other immune-type disorders are often associated with depression. And we're just starting to get, talk about hands in each other's pockets. They're walking around holding hands. So I think that appropriate supplements with their adaptogens and their micronutrients, and B12 especially, because B12, 6, folate, those are the brain vitamins. My personal opinion is that taking them on a regular basis helps to balance some of these complex factors in our brain and body. And for survivors, I think that can be critical to help them deal with the grief and working through that process in a healthy way, regardless of how it occurred. So for those of you who are interested, after I went to Paradise, I updated the grief recovery pyramid and wrote a mini monograph on loss, grief, and recovery. It's on my website. You're welcome to go there, access, print it off, and so on. All right, number 3, the brain and memory. Large sample studies, number 1 concern of people as they are growing older. And let me tell you, I am delighted to be growing older. I've got family members and friends who are much younger than I am who've already crossed the river Styx. I don't care if I'm getting more laugh wrinkles. I'm delighted to be growing older. But my goal is to stay younger longer. And that is possible. So their number 1 concern is memory. Fairly recent research shows that shrinking of brain tissue, the brain tissue actually pulls away from the skull. Shrinking of brain tissue is linked with memory problems. Some researchers say it's normal to have some brain shrinkies as you get older. Okay, what does normal mean? Commonly occurring, we accept it as something that'll happen. It's not inevitable with what I've learned, but because it's normal, people accept that as fact, okay? A lot of people do have some shrinkage, not everybody. Those with the greatest reductions in brain volume are the most at risk for dementia and Alzheimer's, which of course involve altered memory. This one I think we need to take a look at. Overweight and obesity is also linked with brain tissue shrinkage. MRI studies, brains of overweight individuals showed 4% less brain tissue and looked 8 years older than brains of normal weight persons. Brains of obese individuals showed 8% less brain tissue and looked 16 years older than the brains of normal weight persons. So one of the reasons that I'm on a longevity lifestyle is I plan to keep my weight within a normal range because I plan to avoid the brain shrinkage. B12 deficiency. It's one of the reasons I take Delta E every day of my life and twice a day when I travel if I'm also lecturing in the evening. It's been linked with brain tissue shrinkage. Not going there. Rush University Medical Center found that older people, who's an older person?
Somebody other than us.
It's just somebody older than I am. Older people with blood markers associated with vitamin B12 deficiency had the smallest brains because of shrinkage and the lowest scores on tests measuring thinking, reasoning, and memory. And I probably ought to mention water at this point because in the United States, it's common for people over the age of 55 to be dehydrated. They're not drinking enough water, and the brain is more than 3/4 water. So one of the things that IMPaX has, in my brain's opinion, is a wonderful source of water. I've even upped my drinking, although I think I was doing pretty well, but I've just, added a little more since I got my ion machine. Tastes really good, Greg, you know that. What's the problem if you're dehydrated? Well, the brain doesn't have enough fluid volume, and that's another thing that can cause shrinkage. I was listening to a researcher at Stanford not too long ago, and he was talking about this. It's one of my favorite stories. And somebody says, well, what's the big deal if I don't drink enough water? He says, well, you might be leading yourself down the road to dementia, but he says, there's some ugly stuff going on in your brain and body when you don't have enough water, because your brain will get enough water. Other cells give up their need for the brain if you've got a shortage of something, which is amazing to me. It's like the parent who says, well, I'll eat this, here, you have the rest of it. So he says, if you don't drink enough water, your brain will start looking around in your body for where there is some source of fluid. And at any given time, the most likely source of fluid is your bladder. And your brain will say to your bladder, I need some of that stuff. Dehydrated and send me up some fluid. Because I'm desperate. And he said, one of my favorite all-time quotes, that puts a slightly different spin on the term P-Brain. So back to B12. Aging, as the stomach produces less of the acid that breaks down B12 and makes it available for absorption. I'm sure you've seen people at airports and other places just taking antacids by the handful. Okay, even if they have enough B12, it's going to likely interfere with the absorption and so on. Study participants who had taken heartburn and ulcer medications for over 2 years were at a 65% greater risk for vitamin B12 deficiency. That's huge. And just a few more quick things that impact B12. If you've had surgery to remove part of your stomach or make it really small so that you don't have to use any willpower while you're eating, or if you're an absolutely strict vegetarian or vegan who needs some B12 supplementation, if you've got a small intestine disease like Crohn's or celiac, if you've got an immune system disorder, and if you have moderate or higher levels of alcohol consumption. A lot of alcohol research going on that I find fascinating. Do you remember on the news recently the latest recommendation that if you're planning to be pregnant or you are pregnant, you don't even have a drop of alcohol during the entire pregnancy because it's such a neurotoxin to the brain? And I found it interesting as they're interviewing people, they're arguing, well, I just do a little wine. What's a glass of wine gonna do a day? I don't know what's gonna do in a day, but I know if it's my baby and there's any possibility that that's gonna affect that child's brain, you can't give up wine for 9 months? Hello. So the nickname, the brain vitamin, certainly applies to B12 and to some degree to B6 and folate. Here's another good thing. B12 is believed to be preventive against macular degeneration. That runs in my family, so if I'm out and about, I've always got dark glasses on and I'm taking Delta E. It may also help for brain shrinkage and memory problems. Gary Arendash from the Florida Alzheimer's Research Center. Some of you probably have seen this before because I think this is such a stellar statement. In order to optimize brain function over your lifespan, and some of you know that I'm aiming to be a minimum of 122 years old, 165 days. Because that's how old Jean-Louise Calment was when she died in 1997. French woman, 164 days, 122 years. Took up fencing when she was 85. I'm thinking about it. Rode her bike till she was 100. Come on. If she can do it, we can do it.
Yeah.
So in order to optimize brain function over your lifespan, high amounts of brain nutrients are required from what? Food and supplements. And he is very clear that the way food is marketed and grown and prepared these days, you can't get it just from food. So when you hear people say if you're eating right, you don't need supplements, I don't think they're up to date on research. So delta E is my preferred source for B12 and for L-theanine, which tends to fall also as we get older. Not everything can be prevented. You know, someday, all things being equal, I'm going to die. But I want to live to the very longest age that I possibly can before I die, with good mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual function. But it's not going to happen by accident. It's going to happen if you choose to make it happen. Not everything can be prevented, but nothing can be prevented unless individuals implement appropriate strategies. And that's one of the things that I'll always be grateful for, is that Steve persisted in banging on my door, because I was so sick and tired of people telling me about try this, try that, have something else, that I said, I'm not interested in even looking at anything. But he persisted, and EnerPrime and Delta have turned out to be two of the very best things in my life, and I would get rid of almost anything before I would get rid of those. So there you have it. There's a direct brain immune system connection. We see it now literally under the microscope. Suicide likely only occurs in the brains that have been altered. And you've seen some of the ways in which the brain can be altered. And finally, brain shrinkage is linked with memory problems. And some of the things you can do to avoid brain shrinkage we've talked about. So there you have it. I can't do it for you. You're the only person that can do it for you, because you're the only person who's going to be with you for your entire life. So I encourage you to get busy and start aiming higher. Somebody said to me the other day, you really think you're going to live to be 122?
Why not?
And I said, you know what? I don't know. But this I believe. If you aim higher, you'll get farther. Thank you.